And this was always historically a time when the fishing would get tough. We'd be fishing stuff on the bottom, a blade bait, maybe a Damiki or something like that. And we'd be catching them, man, early in the morning, and the sun get up, and you get to 9 or 10 o'clock, and the bite really get hard because the fish started suspending. Hey everybody, welcome back to the channel for the technique of the month. We are here in February, and last year's technique of the month for this was a really popular one, looking back at the number of views that we had on all this stuff. And it was on a technique that I love personally doing so much, and that's finesse cranking. To me, this is where it started, at least for my finesse cranking. A lot of homemade baits and different stuff out there kind of fall into that as well. But in my world of finesse cranking, if you've not watched that one, go back and give it a check. But the technique of the month for this year, kind of a little bit different, and something that would apply in winter situations, a little different from when that finesse cranking bite's going to be good. I think of that especially when you've got, a lot of colored water. Temperature can still be really cold, or it can be more mild, and you catch them that way, but that tends to work well if you have some color in the water. This technique, what we're talking about today, really is better if you've got some clarity. If you've not had a lot of rain, not had a ton of runoff, those fish probably living out a little bit deeper, and that's when this technique is really going to come into play. And these, the two baits that really fit this technique, also part of what we added in that Pick Two More video, if you've watched that for the month of February. So we got a suspending jerk bait, I've got a blade bait, but the technique of the month, what we're going to discuss is fishing kind of the bottoms of cuts or of hollows or hollers, depending on what part of East Tennessee you live in, as far as how you would say that. And I always reference stuff, obviously, around home, places where, close to where I live. But this technique, I've seen it work all across the country. I mean, I have talked to people who have caught them doing exactly this on Toledo Bend and Sam Rayburn down in Texas and Louisiana. This is not a region specific deal. It certainly works on out in the lakes in the Ozark region. But like I mentioned, Sam Rayburn and Toledo Bend, not at all like our lakes, around here in East Tennessee. So, I mean, this technique, definitely don't pigeonhole it as only being good, in a highland reservoir or anything like that, because it works in places all across the country for sure. And I don't fully understand, why the bait fish will congregate down in some of those bottoms of those valleys and bottoms of ditches or even just depressions and stuff, but I know they do. And the fact of knowing that they do that, and knowing that the bass go there, man, that makes it a place where you definitely need to understand what's going on and be able to catch those fish. When those fish are bottom related, that's, to me, some of the easier time to catch them, and when historically we have done better catching them. And that's the time when that blade bait definitely does the best. You don't need, the thing with both of these is, this is really not a cover related type of pattern. I mean, you don't have to have rock or wood or anything. A lot of times you'll catch fish that are literally laying down in the bottoms of these valleys or cuts or hollers that are laying in the mud. I mean, I've caught them and pulled them up from these places, and they literally have dirt on their bellies. It's pretty funny how they'll do that sometimes. But when they are bottom related, that is certainly when that blade bait comes into play. I don't. Again, this is the same one from the Pick Two More video. I don't even know what brand this one is, but most any blade bait is probably going to work. But my favorite is that old school Silver Buddy. One thing that I will do on it, this one is pretty heavy, a pretty heavy piece of metal. It would be hard to do this with, but on a Silver Buddy, you've got a little bit longer tail back here behind that rear treble hook, and I'll take a pair of pliers and I'll bend that tail at about a 45. Just to give that last little bit of it, just a little kink over. Not a 90, you don't want a hard edge on it, but about a 45. And what that will do when that bait falls, instead of just falling right straight back down, it's actually going to cause it to spiral a little bit and to at least spin, a quarter of a turn or half a turn around by having that little bit of a bend in the tail. So that's something to just keep in mind. White or silver are pretty much my go-to ones. I like a white one a lot, and if you can't find any in that, simple can of spray paint will take a chrome one to a white one pretty quick for you. So an easy way to do that. But again, when when the bait is down on the bottom, when the fish are down on the bottom, that's when that blade bait is gonna do best. And that seems like that's usually the case, one, early in the morning, as well as on cloudy, overcast days. That seems like when that bait, tends to stay down on the bottom and the fish stay down there with it. What you'll have happen sometimes on those sunny days, especially if it's a day you don't have a lot of wind, you've got the sun coming out, kind of warming, and those sun rays coming down through the water column. What you'll end up seeing is a lot of times you'll see that bait fish kind of come up off the bottom. And this was always historically a time when the fishing would get tough. We'd be fishing stuff on the bottom, blade bait, maybe a Demiki or something like that. And we'd be catching them, man, early in the morning, and the sun get up, and you get to 9 or 10 o'clock, and the bite really get hard because the fish started suspending. Before forward-facing sonar, it just kind of became a guessing game at that point. You really didn't know just how high they were suspending, just where they were sitting at, and they certainly don't all suspend at the same depth at the same time. So it really became hard to keep up with those fish at that point in time. Now with forward-facing sonar, we can see just what depth they're in, but we can also see, that fish or those 2 or 3 fish that are sitting over there. And what you'll end up seeing a lot on those sunny days, especially without a lot of wind, you'll see the bait starting to come up off the bottom, but then a lot of times you'll actually see the bass, oddly enough, sitting above the bait. The top of the bait may be in 10 or 15 feet of water, but it's like those bass will actually sit up above that ball of bait fish a lot of time, which is, again, something that I don't feel like I've really had an understanding of. That's what was going on. We always, read that the bass would hang out in or below the same depth as the bait. But I think as those days warm up, those fish may be fed early in the morning. They fed heavy when that bait was down there at the bottom. Well, then now it's got nice and it's gotten, kind of warm out and the sun's out. They're just sliding up there and just kind of floating and warming. They're not really active, but if you take a bait like a suspending jerk bait and get it down there in front of that fish, and you can really kind of taunt that fish into biting at that point in time with a bait like a suspending jerk bait, those are fish that you can catch that otherwise you never would have. And that's certainly something that's really come into play in just the last few years. So that the deal with that, if you're fishing that bait that's in the middle of those cuts, the middle of those hollers, you get to that kind of mid-morning, sun's out, not much wind, and you see that stuff start rising in the water column, that's definitely the time to pick up a suspend and jerk bait and try to get that to those fish. A big thing with that, using one that you can make sink is something that seems to be more and more effective. The shadow wrap, especially if you upsize the hooks on it just a little bit, it's going to sink. It's going to sink pretty easily for you. I always carry suspend dots and suspend strips in my boat, and I can make any bait sink at that point in time with those. But I'm always going to upsize my hook some, and then kind of see where my bait's at. And then if I need to add some extra weight to it, I can certainly do that with those suspend dots and suspend strips. It just becomes a minute by minute deal at that point in time of approaching each cadence and each fish and each everything, with that jerk bait as to just how slow they want it, just how fast they want it, and then of course your color selection, kind of based on the watercolor. But getting out in the middle of those drains this time of year, especially if you've got clearer water, man, that's where it seems like those fish really, really go. So again, it was something that I personally started learning when we started fishing the Demiki rig and started fishing vertical like that. But it has morphed from just strictly a vertical presentation now into a horizontal presentation with forward-facing sonar. Very much doing the same, we're chasing the same fish. We're just using different techniques to be able, to catch them out away from the boat now versus having to get the boat over top of them. And they, when that was new, it was okay. They didn't mind it, but the more pressure those fish got, the tougher they got to catch when you'd get the boat over top of them, or they would just vacate from you altogether. So it will change again. Stuff is already changing with forward-facing sonar and just what the fish will allow you to do. but it seems like right now, this time of the year, these are a couple baits that out in the middle of those cuts are going to put fish in the boat for you.